Welcome to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. If you try to tune into our worship service on Facebook live stream, you probably know that we had some internet glitches doing that service. So it was interrupted several times, and so I'm not going to give you my sermon by Facebook and on YouTube. So it is now midsummer. We are 4 months into this season of the pandemic. We're getting restless, waiting to socialize more and get our lives back to some form of normal. But the case numbers we've been hearing in our county indicate that we will be isolating and taking precautions for many weeks or months to come. Vacations and other plans have been abandoned, and we're trying to sort out what our future will look like. Meanwhile, our country is still being convulsed with the social and economic impacts of the virus, while at the same time we're beginning to come to grips with the American original sin of racism. All those struggles might make us just want to spend more time out in the garden tending our plants. And in the cycle of the church year, we are in the season of parables, the stories that Jesus told to help us struggle with the vision that God has for us. So it is fitting that today, and for the next 2 weekends, we are hearing parables about gardens and growth. Today's gospel reading is the first of the parables in the Gospel of Matthew. The crowds are surrounding Jesus, so he gets out into a boat while the crowd gathers on the beach, and Jesus begins to tell them a story. We call this the parable of the sower because that is what Jesus calls it. A man goes out to sow seed. He sows some seed on a paved path, some on rocky ground, some amongst thorns and brambles, and some on good soil. The seed sown on the path was quickly consumed by birds which swept down to eat it. The seed sown on rocky soil began to grow, but they could not establish roots, so they soon withered and died. The seed sown amidst the brambles grew for a while, but the brambles soon overtook them, and they died. Only the seed sown on good soil flourished and bore fruit, and some of them bore fruit in abundance. Now, I know that we have heard and read this parable forever alongside of the explanation that follows it in the gospel. But I just have to wonder, if Jesus had not explained this parable, don't you think we would have been able to guess what he was trying to teach us? The seed is the word of God, and when it is broadcast among people where there are varying degrees of reception with varying degrees of results, we could probably figure that out. When Jesus goes on to explain this parable, I often wish he had saved his explanation for the parables that are really hard to figure out. Take, for example, the parable of the dishonest manager. He gets fired for being dishonest, so he swindles his former boss in order to ingratiate himself with the debtors of his former boss, so that they will be on his side and support him when he seeks into poverty. From this parable, Jesus concludes, "Make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal habitations." Now, don't you wish Jesus had spent just a little more time explaining that parable? In our current passage, Jesus and the disciples go offline for a few verses that do not appear in our lectionary reading. When the lesson skips a few verses, as it does in today's reading, don't you always wonder what is in those missing verses? Do you ever wonder enough that you go home and look up the passage in your Bibles to discover what the lectionary editors had selected out? I recommend you try that sometimes, just to see if there's more to be learned from the part of the passage we don't hear in church. Anyway, in that offline conversation, the disciples ask Jesus privately why he speaks in parables. Actually, they ask him, why do you speak to them, to those other people, in parables? So Jesus explains that only the disciples have been given the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So only they are able to understand what he preaches to them, while other people see but do not perceive, and hear but do not understand. And he goes on to say, to those who have, more will be given, while from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now, don't you wish Jesus would explain that saying to us a little bit more? Anyway, Jesus goes on to explain that in the parable, he goes on to explain this parable to his closest companions who are, as we know, already in on the kingdom's secrets. And as I said, Jesus calls it the parable of the sower. So the story seems to be an answer to the question, why does the gospel find hospitable space to grow among some people, but not amongst others? Or perhaps it answers the question, what are the necessary conditions for fruitful discipleship? So in Jesus' explanation, the sower is the one who spreads the word of God's kingdom into people's hearts. For some people, the evil one comes quickly to snatch away what was sown into their hearts. For other people, the word is received with joy, but trouble and persecution quickly overwhelm the good news before it can take root. For others, the word begins to grow, but ultimately the concerns and cares of the world and the lure of wealth overcome its influence, and the kingdom fails to flourish. But for some, the word of God's kingdom takes root, grows, and bears much fruit. Now it sounds like Jesus is referring to himself as the sower and the seeds as his teachings. Or one might also interpret God as the sower because God is the source of Jesus' teachings. In either case, the sower appears to be careless and extravagant, somewhat irresponsible. Why would he let his teachings fall on the earth, on the path, on rocky ground, and on thorny ground? Now, if we were to imagine someone sowing seeds in a garden in the first century, in the time of Jesus, then I would expect that the seeds were not purchased at the local nursery store or ordered online from the seed supply catalog. Instead, they were carefully and cautiously preserved from last year's harvest and set aside in order to plant next year's crop. So the planting represents an investment in the future at the cost of food that could be eaten today and perhaps for the next several months. To scatter seed indiscriminately is wasteful. Thinking about the resources of the church, we would never squander our meager funds on projects, programs, or people that are not likely to produce a good harvest. If we were planting a new church, we'd plant it in a neighborhood that is sure to grow. If we were funding a new program, we would budget only for something very likely to succeed. To grow the church, we need to study demographics, know our target audience, and carefully develop our communication strategies. But the sower in this parable seems not to care or where the precious resources of the seeds are scattered. The sower is a great risk taker, sowing precious seeds indiscriminately, yet as if all soils were good soil, in well-kept neighborhoods, in rundown neighborhoods, even in the jails and perhaps underneath the bridges. Jesus reminds us that rejection of his message does not mean that the message is wrong or that our efforts are wasted. It is simply a fact of life, and the call to spread the good news of God's love demands that we share it even when there is little hope or likelihood of visible success. But I want to suggest, however, that another lesson may be learned if we read this story as the parable of the 4 soils instead of as the parable of the sower. The seed that fell on good soil brought forth a harvest of grain of varying amounts, according to each sort of soil. In some cases 100-fold, in some cases 60-fold, in some cases 30-fold. The success of the sowing depends on the quality of the soil, on which the seed lands. Except that even with good soil, some individuals bear more fruit than others. The final verse of our reading today says, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." That seems to say that everybody has the ability and potential to be good soil, but not everyone uses those ability and potential to bear fruit. Thomas Merton once wrote about this parable that every moment and every event of every person's life on earth plants something in his or her soul. For just as the wind carries thousands of winged seeds, so each moment brings with it germs of spiritual vitality that come to rest imperceptibly in the minds and wills of men and women. Most of these unnumbered seeds perish and are lost, for such seeds as these cannot spring up anywhere except in the good soil of freedom, spontaneity, and love. So Merton is inviting us to see that this parable is not about the occasional moment when either God or a human evangelist sows a seed about God. Rather, he says that every moment of every part of our lives is a seed infused with spiritual life-giving potential. This is not to suggest that everything that happens is good or controlled by God. Instead, it is to say that the sort of seed that we are, good or bad, rock-filled or thorn-infested, is in each present moment affects how we receive the seeds of experience that are always being sown around us and within us. Merton uses 3 words to describe good soil: freedom, spontaneity, and love. We can help till and fertilize the inner soil of our souls through such spiritual practices as contemplative prayer, Sabbath keeping, and works of mercy such as feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, or visiting the sick and in prison. Regularly practicing silent, contemplative prayer helps us cultivate the soil of inner freedom as we set aside the frenzy of our thoughts and simply open ourselves to the possibility of God's presence. Practicing Sabbath, rest, can help cultivate the soil of spontaneity as we regularly set aside any plans for one day each week, and open ourselves to receive the day in gratitude as it naturally unfolds without undue work or effort on our part. And practicing works of mercy can help cultivate the inner soil of love. For as we practice setting aside our own demands and our own needs and offer ourselves in loving service toward others, we find love becomes more and more our second nature. For fruitful discipleship, we must cultivate soils with freedom, spontaneity, and love. And we must attend properly to the good news of the gospel message, and persevere. Understanding is essential to the success of the seeds in the story. Without understanding, the words find no place to germinate. But understanding does not mean merely accepting. Rather, it comes from this regular practice of contemplative prayer, Sabbath keeping, and acts of loving service. We can introduce toxins into our inner soil through our fear, anxiety, and selfishness. These toxins poison the seeds that God is sowing in our lives and inhibit our fruitful discipleship. In addition, there are toxic systems of oppression, prejudice, and corruption that are out of our direct control yet deeply affect our response to the seeds planted in us. But if we are to have any hope of redeeming these toxic systems, even in part, we must begin with cultivating our own soil. So today's story, whether we call it the parable of the sower or the parable of the 4 soils, invites us to extravagant and indiscriminate sowing, investing the time and care and love and financial resources that God has given us among all sorts and conditions of people, knowing the harvest and the results of our efforts belong to God alone. And this story encourages us to cultivate the inner soil of our hearts through quiet prayer, Sabbath keeping, and loving service, so that the seeds of love and hope that God scatters constantly throughout our lives will have the potential to bear much fruit. Thanks be to God.